Today, I have the pleasure to be in this panel with Minister Richard Lochhead. He's the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Just Transition. Then we have to his left, Sharon Burrow. She's the General Secretary of ITUC, so the International Trade Union. And then Professor Jim Skia. He's the chair of Scottish Just Transition Commission and also co-chair of the Working Group 3 of the IPCC. So this conversation, it brings a lot of issues to my heart, and I really like the way that is framed. Because actually the just transition started in the energy sector, and where many of us starting to call it the just transformation, and it must be a transformation. So how can we put the principles of that just energy transformation into other sectors, and to make it both a cross-cutting issue, but also focus on what are the trade-offs, who wins, who loses, etc. So here, first question to the minister. How do we actually do that? How do we move beyond energy? What are the main lessons that you've learned? And how can we avoid a siloed sector-by-sector approach?
Thank you. And thank you to WWF for having me along today to take part, Vanessa, in your panel discussion here at COP26 in Glasgow. Well, I'm the First Minister for Just Transition in the Scottish Government, so my job is to work with the rest of governments and indeed society across Scotland to ensure that as we go towards our net zero targets in Scotland, which is 2045, 5 years ahead of many other places, that we do that in a planned manner, and we do learn the lessons in the past, because if we're going to go through an economic transformation in particular, then as we move from jobs in carbonised sectors to zero carbon or low carbon, clearly any transformation can often have winners and losers, and what we want to do is make sure this is managed and planned going forward and not repeat the mistakes of when, for instance, Scotland lost its coal industry and people overnight lost their jobs, and we're still seeing the intergenerational scars in some communities in Scotland from that, as is the case across the world that have gone through similar experiences. So my job is to work with people who are directly impacted by the transition and make sure they co-design and that we have good green jobs there for people to move to, and as we go through the next couple of decades in Scotland, that we do that in a just and fair way and we don't leave people behind. And also, you said not to do it by sector approach. Well, clearly we will to a certain extent, working with the Just Transition Commission that we set up in Scotland, who's chairs with us and no doubt will speak shortly. And we'll focus on energy as a high emitting sector first of all, to work with the workers representatives, the businesses themselves and the rest of our communities. This has got to be bottom up as much as top down, this process, so that we take people with us. But also the final point I would make is that the just transition is also about being a window of opportunity. It's a window of opportunity to use the chance of economic transformation to do things differently and to tackle inequalities in society. So that may be tackling fuel poverty as we move towards decarbonised energy, for instance. Also creating good jobs and making sure people get decent pay and decent working conditions in these new industries. So that's the kind of way we're approaching it in Scotland, and I know that's also at the heart of COP26 and is the heart of our climate change legislation in Scotland as well.
Thank you, Minister. And really, I mean, your title just also, rings a bell. I don't think that many places around the world have just transition in their titles. So that's really important. So Jim, I'll go over to you. Really, when we think about these buzzwords, they then become just buzzwords, and everybody feels that it's just easy. We put it there, and we're gonna make it happen. So, what do you see are the biggest trade-offs, and how to manage, who wins, who loses, and how you manage that pathway?
Yeah. So just to say, when the Scottish Government set up the Commission, the invitation was very definitely to provide realistic and practical.
Sorry, Jim, I think...
Is it
perfect.
it working now? Yeah, okay. So when the Scottish Government set up our Commission, the charge was, in fact, to provide realistic and practical recommendations. So I hope we actually succeeded in doing that. But we thought a lot as well about the scope of what just transition made in a Scottish context, because I think it does vary from one kind of country or region to another. And it couldn't be about coal, because the last coal-fired power station in Scotland closed 5 years ago. So we have to broaden the agenda, so it has to move on to oil and gas, for example, but we thought it had to move into other sectors like agriculture and land, and also, importantly, we thought it applied to the sort of the demand side of the economy and consumption as well, which is where some of the who benefits, who pays issues start to come up. So we've identified lots and lots of very specific issues that are relevant in terms of who benefits and who pays. So far, decarbonisation in Britain has been mostly paid for by electricity consumers. That's basically a flat tax. That is not an equitable way of doing it. So this is one of the issues we've raised about the who pays agenda. If we move to the land and agricultural sector, farmers are really feeling quite threatened by the low carbon net zero agenda at the moment, because the idea is that agricultural land would be converted for woodland, for example. And given the kind of the land tenure arrangements, the frequency of tenancy agreements, that is a challenge as well in terms of who benefits and who might pay. But if I can bring it back to the supply side, there's a very obvious one. As jobs change in energy supply, people will need to do different jobs, and they do have applicable skills, and there are opportunities. But at the moment, people have to pay for a lot of their own training and their own certification to actually make that move. The diver on an oil and gas platform who has to pay £1,500 to do the same job on an offshore wind platform. This is not a sensible way to do it. So some of these who pays issues and how they're captured is, we've identified the issues, we produced some recommendations in our first report, but we will get stuck into the detail because we have been invited to provide advice and scrutiny for poor Richard there in the middle, and also to develop ways of monitoring and evaluate progress, which will come down to very specific indicators that will touch on the who pays side of it.
Thank you, Richard, and I thank you, Jim. And I really like the who pays and who benefits instead of who wins and who loses. So we will all win, but it's a matter of who pays that transition and who manages that transition. So it's a very important point. So Sharon, I think that Jim's intervention very much makes a bridge to your intervention. So when he talks about jobs, when he talks about skills, how do you actually identify which are the jobs, which are the skills, and how you make it happen? So Sharon, over to you.
Thank you, and let me start by saying to WWF, thank you for constructing something that does go beyond energy. Energy is the foundation, no question. And we've got to get the just transition right for both workers and communities. But it's about every sector. We know we're in a race against time for both people and the planet. And when you think about the issues, and yesterday or the day before, I've lost track of time already, I was talking with Eskom in South Africa. And when they think about these issues, the only way they're going to retain vibrant communities and jobs for people is if they integrate across the supply chains. So let me say to Jim, fantastic, because the Scottish Just Transition Commission was the first beyond simply exiting from coal. Now, we're very proud of Canada and Germany and the others who've actually looked at these things on a tripartite basis. But we now need to think about just transition as being in every sector. And some of the foundations of renewable energy give us hope. There are jobs in renewable energy. For every 10 jobs, there's 5 to 10 in the manufacturing supply chain. There's, if they're good jobs with decent wages, there's another 30 to 35 in the broader community. This is how you build economies. And we also know that when you invest, indeed pound for pound or dollar for dollar, in clean solutions, clean tech, in heavy industry, etc., then you get twice as many jobs as you do in fossil fuels. It doesn't, however, reduce the pain of the transition for workers and their communities. So having national jobs plans, and we want to see, Jim, the challenge now is to turn that fantastic set of recommendations into a national jobs plans, but we also want to see company jobs plans, because it is all about us, all of us taking responsibility. Otherwise, we won't make the time frame. So yes, in terms of what is just transition, Vanessa, it's very simple. We want jobs, jobs and jobs, jobs plans. So we say climate-friendly jobs with just transition. We need secure pensions for older workers, or for those very close to retirement age, a bridge to secure pensions. But we also need skills, skills and skills. And in order to make the transition on skills, we actually need to ensure that we have income support, the skills support and the redeployment support through the process, because that gives people a sense of security, that they have a hope for a secure future for themselves and for their children. But we need community renewal as well, because people will be very, very risk averse if the fear of seeing their communities disintegrate. And Minister, you said it, in fact, that you've had the coal transition here, not handled well, and we can learn from that though and make sure that the future is indeed a just future.
Thank you, Sharon. And I'll make a very, very quick commercial here. Please prepare your questions, because we'll have time for questions, hopefully a couple of questions from the floor and maybe a couple of questions online. And by the way, my name is Vanessa Perez-Irera. I'm the deputy lead of WWF's Global Climate and Energy Practice. I missed to introduce myself right at the beginning. So going back again to you, Minister. Jim talked about the fear or the expectation of farmers and the land use sector. They're afraid of the transition, right? What would you say to them? What are the elements that can be taken into consideration of the energy transition that can be brought to the just transition in the land sector? But also, how do you manage the synergies and the overlays? Because there will be synergies and overlays between the transitions in both sectors. So over to you, Minister.
Yeah, it's a huge question. And Scotland is a largely rural country. For those of you from outside of Scotland, I hope you get a chance to see it at some point. We're very lucky. We've got lovely landscapes and clean waters. And as a result of that, we have fantastic food and drink and a great agriculture sector. Now, our agricultural sector is not as carbon intensive as other countries. We've got very much grass-fed livestock and lots of large landscapes. But you know, it's a big challenge, and Jim's right. Our farmers are concerned about what the impact will be as we move towards net zero. But our land is an asset, and it's an asset in terms of our transformation to net zero, because we want to have climate-friendly food production, and we're able to use our natural resources in Scotland to do that. So we have to do a lot more of that. That could present opportunities for food producers in terms of our farmers. And as we've seen in recent years, our farmers have taken on more of a role in terms of stewarding our environment and landscapes, as well as direct food production. And clearly that role has got a lot of relevance to reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture in Scotland and land use, because land use, of course, is a big emitter of emissions in Scotland per se, not just from farming, but per se, and therefore they can play a role in that. And we have regional land use partnerships we've now set up in Scotland, because a key part of the just transition is that the people impacted most by this transformation are at the heart of deciding how they adapt, and the policies we put in place. And the Just Transition Commission gave us that recommendation. That's absolutely essential. So our farmers are working closely in partnership with local communities through the regional land partnerships, land use partnerships. And also we have a land commission set up in Scotland, which is a permanent body. It looks at the use of our land and how land is used in the public interest, and ownership of land as well as in the public interest. And we will be looking at more land reform legislation in the Scottish Parliament that will look potentially at a public interest test in terms of land ownership and use. So there's a lot happening just now. Like many of our answers today, it's all about partnership and collaboration, and what's really important, and the farmers are up for this because they're doing a lot of good stuff already, even publicising this week to coincide with COP some of the steps they're wanting to take to reduce their carbon footprint. So that's at the heart of everything we have to do.
Thank you, Minister. And that also is a great segue to what I want to ask Sharon, and it's about the social contract, the social partnerships needed. So what in your experience, how important this is? And of course we know it's critical, but how important this is and how to make it happen. What have you learned in terms of social partnerships?
So again, we look to Scotland and a number of small other states, because your approach to well-being is in fact part of the new social contract we need to build. I'm actually an ambassador for the Wellbeing Alliance, and we're totally committed to looking at wealth and inclusion beyond GDP. So when the union movements talk about a new social contract, it's because we have a broken labour market. 60% of our world's workers are in informal work. No rights, no rule of law, no social protection, and no minimum wages, of course. And indeed, 40% in the more formal jobs, in most of the jobs in our economies, there's a third of them who are in insecure or precarious work. And you've just touched on one sector where we know that's the reality, in agriculture, but also in many other areas, services, and with internet-mediated platforms now. So we say a new social contract needs jobs, jobs and jobs. Climate-friendly jobs have to be with just transition measures. But we also need to make sure that our societies come back to a rights-based environment for everybody, for workers, for everybody. And indeed we need universal social protection, or we're not going to have any hope of income equality for women, or indeed racial inclusion. So when we talk about a new social contract, you can't do it alone. Of course, workers want the convergence of crisis dealt with: inequality, the climate emergency and the pandemic, and therefore the reality that we can't underfund health care, education, childcare, etc. any longer. But we've got to deal with these things in an integrated way. So it requires partnership. It requires partnership with governments. It requires partnership with employers and with civil society. We know, and we could never have achieved, just taking one example, just transition in the Paris Agreement, indeed, if we didn't have a coalition of social partners, and it was WWF who stood, absolutely by our side, Human Rights Watch, key members of the more progressive business, and indeed some governments in alliance. So we learned a lesson that if you want human rights and you want just transition and you want decent work for all, this is in everybody's interest. So working together makes us much stronger, and it certainly makes us much more influential with ministers like the Minister for Just Transition. That's a great job, by the way. I think I want that title when I grow up.
Me too, and my kids too. I have a question for you, Jim, but I know that you want to reply to Sharon, so go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to say that I think the broad nature of the Just Transition Commission in Scotland and its membership was actually crucial for the fact that it was successful. I mean, if we wind back the clock a bit, it started with Friends of the Earth Scotland and the Scottish Trade Union Congress getting together to form a joint transition partnership that, in a sense, put the pressure on the government in Scotland to put in place the machinery we've got now. And I can just say that having the trade union movement represented on that Just Transition Commission and the environmental NGOs and other very relevant communities was actually crucial to the success. It needs business to be in there as well. It needs people from the farming community. And we had a little sprinkling of academics, but not too many, to keep it in there. That, I think, was key to the success. Remember the ILO principles. It's about process as well as outcome.
Oh, I completely agree, and it's alignment, and that's why I really like the word social contract and social pact, because otherwise you don't align the number of stakeholders that you actually need for this. So Jim, thinking about the synergies that can be generated in the just energy transition or just energy transformation, what would you say about the synergies and the co-benefits for nature? How do we ensure they happen? And I really like the IPCC IPBES joint report from the workshop. That was a fantastic document. So how do we do that?
Yeah, I won't comment so much on that one. That was the subject of a little issue between IPCC and IPBES, but to leave that behind. I mean, Scotland is as Richard has said, is a very rural kind of environment, and let's not forget the ocean and the North Sea and that part of it as well. So I think there are many ways in which we can join it together. I mean, the big opportunities now that peatlands are inside the national emission inventories, there is a big incentive in a place like Scotland to make sure that peatlands are restored or they're protected properly. The big issues around the planting trees in the right place with etc. We've got all that. That's an important part of the picture as well. So. And it's very much tied up to the landscape, which is actually very important for Scotland, not just economically, it's a cultural factor as well that's really important.
And can I tell you, Vanessa, if you
Sure.
invest in ecosystem repair, we just released a study with the World Resources Institute last week, the week before or something, and it shows that you actually get 3.5 jobs for every dollar invested that you'll get from investing in fossil fuel jobs. Now, if they're good jobs, again, those rural communities are going to benefit from this. So I'm totally on Jim's side about, repair of ecosystems, the biodiversity that WWF so, amazingly champions.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And yes, we published a report called Nature Hires last year, and we actually did a calculation of the different nature-based solutions interventions and how many jobs you could get from them, and it's incredible. It's actually quite amazing what you get from there, and also in many countries sometimes the lower income communities can get the highest benefit from those. So I'd love to get a couple of questions from the floor if possible before I invite you to do either another question that I have in my mind or comments to what you've heard from your peer panelists. So is there questions from the floor? No? Yes, please.
Thank you. Jamie Livingston from Oxfam, Scotland. Coming back to the question about who pays, I wonder if the panel would say anything around the role of taxation within that process, because all the evidence globally and at UK level clearly shows that we're in the crisis that we're facing, and that crisis is going to move without action from dangerous to catastrophic levels because of the emissions of the richest in society. It goes, therefore, does it not, to suggest that the funding of climate action needs to be funded by progressive taxation that not only targets high incomes and wealth, but also high emitting activities to drive down the excessive carbon emissions of that top 1 and top 10%. What action does the Scottish Government plan to take in terms of funding the just transition, accelerating the just transition by taxing the high emitters in Scotland? Thank you.
You want to take that?
I have to be very careful how I answer that question.
Yeah, yes, I can give you a bit more, so some more minutes.
Well, firstly, the principle. Let's talk about the principle that Jamie mentions, and that's something we would support. I mean, you know, clearly, both in a global context, speaking at COP26, and here we are in Glasgow, which was described as the second city of the empire, and then helped drive forward and invent the Industrial Revolution, which has created a lot of the problems that we're trying to solve at COP26 in Glasgow today. Therefore, the countries that have caused a lot of the problems have got a moral obligation to help the global south, and other countries are dealing with the impacts. So that's a principle at a global level, and I absolutely agree that it's a principle we should consider at a local level and a national level in Scotland. Obviously, I'm a member of the Scottish Government. We have very limited role in terms of taxation and fiscal measures, but that is absolutely something we want to continue to discuss with the UK government and see how that can be used. So the principle is something clearly that we support, and we've got to, over the next few years, work out the best way to do that, because at the heart of the just transition, again, is that we should not have anyone in society dealing with a disproportionate burden in terms of cost or other impacts of the transition. And it's the opposite. We want to use the transformation to tackle fuel poverty, not widen the gap between, you know, less well-off and the well-off. We actually want to use it to tackle fuel poverty and other issues in society. So I do agree that's all got a role to play. My final comment is, at the moment we do use, for instance, some of the income from our offshore assets in terms of renewables, because we've got no say really over fossil fuels offshore, to support coastal communities, and we have begun to look at that. You know, so some of the money that's generated in offshore wind farms, and there's community benefits negotiated, and they go to coastal communities to help them with economic development measures and so on. So, you know, it's absolutely something we support.
Can I just say, Vanessa, the world doesn't have a choice. We have to actually redress the regressive taxation policies that have been in place. That's a moral imperative. But we also have to say, how are we going to fund it? It's both the transition and the just transition. And everybody has to accept that there's a responsibility here, but it shouldn't be on the poorest disproportionately. So it's inevitable that carbon taxes have to be on the agenda, pure and simple. If you're going to continue to not take responsibility for reducing a carbon footprint, you're going to have to pay for that. That's the disincentive approach. On corporate taxation, you've seen all of us battle for the minimum corporate taxation piece that the G20 members, government members just supported at the leaders level, led by the OECD. It's at a minimum at 15%, but let's take it and build on it. But there's also the energy poverty question that the Minister raised. And today, with business through the B team and with the mayors through the C40, with the ITUC, we released a statement that says just transition it must include the questions of energy poverty, because just as if workers are frightened of losing their jobs, you know, it will set us back in the transition. But if people can't put food on the table because they're paying for the spiralling energy costs, which I don't think any of us anticipated accurately, then that's going to set us back as well, because fear is the great resistor to any change. So we do have to think about what are the mechanisms. Are they best delivered through cities? Are they best delivered through people themselves? But what's the redistribution mechanism that can only come from the collective wealth of taxation?
Jim?
Yeah, okay. And accepting the premise behind the question, I think just looking backward, it's very obvious that had the British decarbonisation, which has mainly taken place in the electricity sector, been paid for through taxation rather than electricity prices, it would have been fairer. And I think that is a very obvious conclusion. And if Richard hadn't said so, I was also going to give him a little back by saying that taxation is, of course, largely a UK reserved responsibility. But there are other kind of economic signals as well. There's taxes and charges. So what can be done at the local authority level for charging for parking, for example? I dare to just mention airport levies, which is a touchy subject all over the place at the moment as well. So there are lots of other ways of thinking about it, and it may not always come in the form of a carbon tax in pounds per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. There are other kind of economic signals that could be used to move you.
Thank you, Jim. And that conversation, we could be here for hours, because it's actually how you make it happen, and how you actually apply the polluter pays principle in the most equitable way, and in the most socially viable and socially fair way. So that's critical. I have a question from the audience that is online for Sharon. So how do we get these skill sets from the onset? So how do we actually manage that transition within the education system right from the start? And what do you think should be the role of governments, and then, of course, from civil society or other players in making that kind of reset?
Well, I used to be a teacher in a very long life ago, but there is no alternatives but working together with unions, with business, with the teaching profession across all levels, and indeed with government, to say, how do we plan for, fund and include everybody in skills development? Because none of us comes ready-made out of schooling or any other experience for the life roles we will have. And so for me, I'm passionate about lifelong learning. I don't understand why we've been talking about it for 30 years and it's still not something that's just part of our cultural mix of work and learning. So we have to say, it's very simple from our perspective. The industries of today are largely the industries of tomorrow. You're still going to have construction, transport, agriculture, pick an industry, energy. And so workers will still work in those industries, but the technologies will be different. So we talk about just transitions for climate, but that also implies just transitions for technological change, and skills have to be at the heart of that. So you have to plan for it. Sometimes it will be a just-in-time approach. So we're introducing new technology, we need to reskill, or you've got to get a new job, we need to upskill. But most of the time, we can underpin this if we think about education from schools to vocational education to universities to work as part of a continuum, and part of a skills recognition system that actually acknowledges that people build skills and experience, on the journey.
Thank you, Sharon. And going back, Jim, because there's more interest on the economic mechanisms and instruments. What, in your experience, has worked well in terms of best economic instruments? And of course, if you have any specific recommendation from for Scotland.
Yeah. Well, just to say that this is the subject of great debate as we are constructing the next IPCC Working Group 3 report on mitigation and how to deal with instruments. But I think one thing that's very worthwhile mentioning, there are some pretty traditional instruments that work pretty well around regulation and information. In sectors like transport, housing standards, regulation works. And what you actually need to do is make it more ambitious and spread its scope a bit. So it's not all just economic instruments. But I think in terms of carbon pricing certainly has a way to go. But the people who will respond to it most, in the most direct way, are the big players. For example, the people who are thinking about the hydrogen and the carbon capture and storage and that side of it, because they're the people that think in that kind of way. I mean, the thing is, especially with the transport, we already, for example, tax transport surface fuels so heavily. You wouldn't notice a carbon tax if you added to it, because the tax is so high already. So I think you need to be quite careful about the way that you're designing it. Look at the existing sort of regulatory structure that you're trying to superimpose it on. I think because regulations implicitly carry a carbon price in them as well.
Thank you, Jim. I want to go back to the minister. I mean, as far as what I've heard today, there's lots to do still, lots to figure out, but you could call Scotland a case study and a model for the world in many ways. And so I'd love to hear from you what can be said, what can be exported, but also what you need from the international arena and what you need for it to happen, or what could it happen in this COP and in the international regime that would make your work easier. Yeah, over to you.
When I was a bit younger and I was an opposition politician, or just getting into Parliament back in 1999 when we set up the Parliament, I was involved in writing my party's policies and inputting to our manifestos, which were unsuccessful for the first couple of elections in the Scottish Parliament, but have been successful ever since 2007. And a big part of what I was obsessed with, and many people in Scotland are obsessed with, and this is why we are where we are today, I think, showing some leadership, is that Scotland is naturally blessed with natural capital, which we were discussing earlier on, and we have used that partly to produce carbon emissions through the oil and gas industry, and that's been a vitally important sector for employment and all sorts of reasons for decades. But here we are today and we're having to decarbonise. But we have a big advantage. We've got a natural advantage in Scotland, and that's why we are taking this so seriously. Firstly, we think we've got a moral obligation to do that for the reasons discussed, but secondly, we have the opportunity to make our contribution to the world in terms of net zero and the work that's taking place here at COP26. So we've got a bit of a head start, and we've also got the skills that are transferable from some of these other industries that can be transferred into renewables in terms of offshore, etc. So we've got a lot of experience we can bring to this debate, and so we think there's a lot of opportunities here to create good green jobs in Scotland and achieve our targets, and that's why our net zero targets that's probably the reason why we're 5 years ahead of the 2050 targets that are adopted elsewhere. What do we need from the international community? Well, clearly Scotland's a little bit player in the global effort to get to net zero for the planet, and we just want to work in partnership, share best practice, collaborate. Every discussion I've taken part in at COP26 so far has repeated over and over again the concept of collaboration and partnership, because no government is going to be able to do this alone, no one industry or sector. It's only going to be through collaboration, so we have to do that at an international basis. And even yesterday I was speaking to the governor from Louisiana, and he told me that every day they lose the equivalent of a football pitch to coastal erosion in Louisiana. They've had 5 hurricanes in the last 14 months, 2 of which were the severest on record. And they have a high dependency on fossil fuels in terms of jobs and their oil and gas industry. I think it's Louisiana and Texas within the states that have the biggest dependency. So we've got a lot in common with them to a certain extent, and we all have to work together and learn from each other. So that's what I'd like from the international community, is to work with us, share best practice. We hope Scotland can play a bit of a leadership role, and we've got a history of invention and innovation in our universities and research sector in Scotland. We want to apply that to net zero as well.
Thank you, Minister. And I would like to hear from all of you. What is, and maybe we can start by Jim and then Sharon and then the Minister. What is the single biggest thing that needs to happen in the just energy transition or just energy transformation debate at the moment? What do you think is a single thing that can happen, and what is a a recommended next step for Scotland. So, Jim.
Yeah, you've asked me the same question I've had from the media so many times over the last few days. What's the single biggest thing? And, I would kind of say, well, you're asking me for the silver bullet, and I'm going to push you back and say there's a portfolio of things you need to do to actually achieve it. But what we emphasised in our Just Transition Commission report was, first of all, the idea of planning. With a proper process there to make sure that things are happening, because unplanned transitions tend to be unjust transitions. We placed a huge amount of emphasis on the skills agenda, making sure there was transferability of skills between different sectors. We wanted to see a big emphasis on community and the sense of place, so where you are actually matters. And then the final one was what came up from the question earlier on, the who benefits and who pays issue, that these were the sort of the 4 prongs that need to be addressed. So I gave you 4 silver bullets rather than 1, but that was my attempt.
No, thank you, Jim. And I honestly also with this COP, I think it as a 3-stool leg, and normally it's more than one thing. Definitely what keeps something stable and moving. So thanks for pushing back on that one. So Sharon, back to you. What needs to happen next in the global debate, in the global narrative? Where do we need to be moving towards?
Well, it actually starts at the local level. Sorry, Vanessa, we're destroying your question, but dialogue and transparency are the magic bullets across those portfolio areas Jim talked about. When people can see that at least there's a plan for a future where they and their children can be included, and they can have some sort of say about their own communities, then you build that collective sense of responsibility to get action, enabled. And so I would say to you, dialogue, transparency, having a plan.
Fantastic. Minister, what are your plans next?
Well, like the international community, from a Scottish perspective, and it is vitally important internationally, is that we move into the delivery stage. We know what we've got to do. We have ideas about how to get the solutions into place. We've got to get on with it now, and we need action. So in Scotland, we're doing our best now, going into the delivery stage. We recognise that we can't talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk, and we need that internationally as well. So what comes next is delivery. And so I won't go through it all, but we're also putting measures in place just now in Scotland. I saw one of them was highlighted in the Greenpeace website as a case study from around the world of a successful transition measure being put in place, and they highlighted the Just Transition Commission and also a skills training fund we have to help people move from carbonised to decarbonised industries. So it's delivery now. That's what I want, delivery from the international community here at COP and beyond, and that's our responsibility in Scotland to start delivering and not just talk about this.
Moving quickly and probably one step back, but there has been one question, very interesting question coming from the virtual audience. So Scotland has moved beyond coal, right? But other regions in Europe haven't, and they're just starting this journey. So what would your advice be on kind of the first steps? And I think a lot of the last question can relate to that, but really sometimes they're in this very difficult position, right? So where do they start? What's the easiest point or the best point for starting that can allow them to leapfrog? We have 2 events with ministers from European countries that are still quite dependent on coal. What would you say to them?
Well, set up a Just Transition Commission. It would be maybe my first bit of advice. I think we've covered the answers to that question throughout this meeting, and that is clearly that people have to work together. We have to be transparent. The mistake that was made in the UK in the 1980s, when the government at the time, for essentially politically ideological reasons, shut down the coal industry, and showed very little regard to the thousands and thousands of people who were going to be thrown out of a job, and that's led to social and economic problems that exist to this day in the 21st century in these communities. So, you know, clearly my advice from my bitter experience in Scotland is to avoid that, and politicians, and they're just one player in the scene, but they have to put themselves in the shoes of the people that are directly affected by decisions they take, and work with these people and make sure we all go along on that journey together. It's not people dictating to other people who then feel alienated and victimised and harmed by decisions that are taken that they're not involved in. So that's why, you know, I'm very proud that Scotland we're getting good feedback from the international community at COP about our just transition approach. But that is at the heart of the just transition approach, and that's one of the main reasons why we're doing it, is to make sure we get it right. Because the next 10 years, in particular in Scotland and elsewhere in the world, is going to be incredibly radical transformation of our economy. And that's a big, risky exercise. It's full of fantastic opportunities, but it's got a lot of risk as well, so we have to get it right.
Completely. Anyone else from the floor want to make a question? Yes?
Hello, I'm Robert Pollock. I'm with the European Union's Co-Regions in Transition initiative. And there was a lot of discussion, you know, about how we have to move to delivery. And I thought on Monday, one of the key words that kept recurring in discussions was silos. We operate in silos. So just given we've got such a learned panel and the discussion's been great, I would just like to ask, how will the machinery of government have to change? And I'm not just being specific to Scotland, I mean at the European level, the global level, but how will the machinery of modern government have to change so that we can rapidly move into this implementation phase? And I guess I've given a bit of a clue with the word silos in my question, but I'd really appreciate your thoughts on that, because it's just recurring across Europe, this issue of how do we reinvent government rapidly enough for this huge historic challenge.
Great question. You want to take
Well, I'd
Sharon?
like to have a go at that, because I think that is at the core of government responsibility and what, you know, those who elect democratic governments expect of them. And you can come back to the wellbeing model and say, if you have, I think it's Wales that has a commissioner for the future, and they've legislated a set of basically ambitions. New Zealand has a set of frameworks that all ministries have to actually show alignment with. If we're going to deal with a convergence of crisis, you're absolutely right. You can't have finance ministers looking at just GDP while employment ministers are trying to drive jobs, and indeed climate ministers are trying to deal with net zero emissions. Yeah, you have to deal with all of these things together, and people and the planet have to be at the forefront of that. So, you know, we talk about something that people don't think about in terms of a sector being care. If COVID-19 has shown us anything, it's that we need the resilience of health, education, childcare, aged care in our communities as a foundation, whether it's a health shock or an economic shock or a climate emergency. So you need those foundations of resilience even as you actually transition industries. And to the last question, you can't do the transition which Europe is tackling somewhat in silos, but in steel, aluminium, cement, auto, construction standards, all happening, but often not happening in an integrated and aligned way, with indeed the supply chains mapped, which are often overlapping, and there are good jobs in them, so that we're actually investing in the technologies and the jobs that come from that. So I'm totally in alignment. The only way you're going to do it is you're probably not going to deconstruct ministries overnight, but you can actually provide responsible outcomes that ministries have to account for their actions against, and structure the kind of cross-government dialogues that make it possible.
Thank you, Sharon. We have another question, but I don't know if Jim or the minister want to add. Yeah, magic hands, Jim.
Okay. On the question of silos, I do find it very interesting that some of the most creative just transition initiatives are not taking place at the national level, but are taking place in regional kind of polities that have 5 or 6 million people involved with them. You know, Upper Silesia, Ruhr, Galicia, Scotland, etc. And I think that, you know, since I deal with the UK government as well as the Scottish one, it is a very different character, because in this size of polity, everybody is sort of one handshake away from everybody else. And I do think it leads to a better joined up kind of approach. And it's very interesting, you know, when the new Scottish government came in May, there is a shuffling round of the portfolios, and every minister appears to have three nouns in their job title. You know, just transition, employability and fair work, I think for you, Richard. So you've got these three things together. So I think there is more automatically a kind of joining up if you take it to the right kind of level. And you know, the size of the whole of Germany, the whole of France, the whole of the UK is not necessarily the right way to do it.
No, Jim, thank you for that, because I also think that one of the sectors that need to, and depending, of course, how do you take energy, right, is the transport sector, and also it's a mandate. It's a mandate from cities. Transport is within the mandate of cities, and so you actually have to take it at that level. Otherwise, there's no other way.
Exactly,
Sharon, yeah.
Vanessa. And I just want to add to Jim, like, cities are so important. I've spent a lot of time this week talking to mayors because we have a robust partnership with the C40. But it's not about one issue. It's about all of those integrated issues. And when you think about cities and those rural ambitions, or indeed the energy transition, or whatever it might be in the supply chains, the catalyst of the demand and supply curves are from cities. They're from big populations. And their relationship with communities in the hinterland, or indeed internationally, are really significant. So using the procurement power, not just of national governments, but indeed of cities or rural councils, is vital, because unless the standards that you raise are there everywhere, it's not going to work.
I like that, and I also like that, you know, that takes us back to that whole society approach, right? Christy, I think there was another question from the floor.
Thank you. Danai Kyriakopoulou, I'm an economist at the London School of Economics. I liked your framing in the beginning about how it's not about winners and losers, and it's about benefits. And one other process where we had this discussion about winners and losers was with globalization, and we saw a policy reversal there. And I was wondering if you think there are parallels there, and if there are lessons that we can learn, especially thinking about Jim's discussion about the economic tools that we can use. Thank you.
Who wants to take that? Yeah, go, Minister.
Okay, so
you can have that.
Well, I'll just make a very brief comment. I mean, I'll let Jim come in on the economic aspects, perhaps, but I think one lesson from globalisation is alienation, and we've spoken a lot about how the just transition's got to have at the heart of it co-design with the people directly affected, and it's got to be bottom up as much as governments and everyone else playing their role. And clearly globalisation, some of the lessons that were learnt is people feel alienated to a certain extent from globalisation. Globalisation has also led to the concentration of wealth, and so I think some of these issues are definitely taken into account by the need for a just transition in terms of what we're going to go through with the future economic transformation.
Yeah, this was good academic sparring. This is the London School of Economics and Imperial College, going at each other there. You know, just to say, I think there are very interesting challenges, because I think, you know, no matter how small a kind of country or region are, everybody is connected now. And it's very difficult to disassociate, I think, the just transition ideas that are taking place within particular places from the wider global implications. And just to flag one particular area, the oil and gas sector, this is not a national issue, it's not just a regional issue in Europe. These are global industries, and steps that are taken in one particular country spill over and have implications elsewhere. And I think it's certainly the case that we need to think as well about just transition in international terms as well as just transition within countries. And I think that is it's something we have not really grappled with yet, but I'm sure that people like WWF will want to expand the scope and take these very issues on.
Thank you, Jim.
But it's actually critical, because if you looked at the partnership that's emerged here as a possible model, it's Germany, France, UK, and one other actually funding, and the US, funding, investing in South Africa's energy transition in order that South Africa can then actually look to transform its other sectors. And that comes with just transition, a jobs plan, etc., led by the President of South Africa himself. So what you do here, I mean, we were talking earlier about taking Jim on tour, because what you do here is really important for others to hear. And we want just transition commissions, Minister, everywhere, because it makes people talk to each other. And if you're talking to each other and you have that broad representation, and you've got the communities in those countries, you know, actually feeling like they can talk to somebody about issues that concern them, you're not going to find too many different ambitions. Sometimes the context and the culture will be different, but people still want security. They want jobs for themselves and their kids. They want an economy and a government they can trust is going to be there to support them. So exporting our best ideas, but it comes back again to dialogue, to transparency, to people knowing there's a plan.
Oh, and I like that, Sharon, and I think that I completely agree. And blocks and that type, those type of partnerships are crucial. But I also agree with Jim that this needs to be elevated to the international arena. And when you think about oil and gas, I mean, there's just no budget for more exploration of oil and gas. There's no carbon budget for additional exploration. So it's critical, and it's critical that we get sufficient stakeholders to be aligned. So I'd like to just run by the last round of final comments. Jim, from your end, any final remarks about the conversation here, and Sharon, and then Minister to end.
Yeah, well, what I think is really interesting, and it's there in the title of the event, is actually expanding the scope of just transition to cover the wider range of equity and social issues associated with the transition that needs to happen. There are many areas in which I don't think we have thought it through properly at the moment. So I think, in the Scottish case, we're kind of at the end of the beginning. I think we produced a world-class set of recommendations, but that's not necessarily a world-class set of actions. And we really did, as Richard said earlier, to move it on to the delivery stage. That's going to be a big challenge. But we also need to raise our eyes to the horizon a bit and look for the scope issues.
Fantastic. Pivot to implementation and delivery. Sharon.
I think the integration question, we have to think of the societies that we live in and the vast array of, the interconnecting commitments we can make to give people opportunities to build their own futures. So it starts with people talking to each other. It starts with a government who's listening, who's got the courage to put ministerial responsibility for things like just transition in place. So this is really, again, it comes back to that. Are we committed to take joint responsibility, and will governments stand by, workers, business, communities, and make it happen?
Thank you, Sharon. Minister.
I hope that COP26 firstly gets agreements that we want to see, so we can achieve our net zero targets. That's the first clear ask of all the countries here. I also hope it changes the dial in terms of raising awareness of how serious climate change is and the importance of just transition, and raises awareness of just transition, which must not be a bubble issue. It has to be something that every ordinary citizen across the world is aware of and understands what it's about and the role they can play within it. So that's been very much at the forefront of my mind throughout COP26 so far, is people. Climate change is about saving the planet, biodiversity. It's also about people, and people who are in jobs at the moment who may be anxious about the future and what all this means for them. So that's been more at my forefront of my mind than ever before, listening to all the comments and debates and discussions that I've been involved in throughout COP. And the second final point is that it's all a big opportunity as well. It's not a threat, it's not something we should just be anxious about and worried about. It can bring enormous benefits to the world, a healthier planet, but people living better lives as well. And that's an absolutely essential message that we have to find ways to articulate as much as possible, so that people are not just reading their newspapers or watching television and hearing that the planet's in danger, which it is, but also about things can be better. Not only can we save the planet and humankind, but we can make things a lot better. And that's why it's worth making those changes in the times ahead.
Definitely, things can be better. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Minister Sharon, Jim. This has been fantastic discussion. Thank you, everyone.